Hello, 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 everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Unpack This with me, Gloria Bailey-Ray, the authentic coach. I am so excited to have you here. This is season 4, and in this season, we're talking about relationships, not just romantic relationships, right? But we're talking about how we enter into relationships, how we behave while we're in them, and how we leave them, and the patterns we keep repeating while telling ourselves that we have moved on. Today's conversation is called, get this, the behaviors we normalize, right? We are going to unpack 4 terms that have been circulating in conversations about modern relationships. Ghostlighting, Banksying. Yeah, that was a new term for me. Monkey barring, as well as zip code commitment, right? Now, some of you actually may be thinking, like I was, you know, authentic coach, where do people come up with these names? And honestly, I don't know. Every time we turn around, somebody has created another word to describe something people have probably been doing for decades, right? And the terminology, that may be new, but the behavior is not new. So, you know, example, disappearing instead of communicating is not new. Lying to avoid accountability, that's not new. Emotionally leaving a relationship before physically ending it, that's not new either. How about keeping somebody on standby until you find your next replacement? Not new. And acting committed only when it's convenient. It's definitely not new. We just have new names for old behaviors, right? But here is why these conversations matter. Something or sometimes having a name for something, it actually helps us to recognize, right? It gives us language for an experience that left us confused. We knew. Again, that comes back to that gut. We knew in the gut something didn't feel right, but you just couldn't explain why. You knew that maybe you were being treated poorly, but perhaps you normalized that behavior. And you may have even told yourself, that's just how dating is now. This is how relationships work. Everybody has communication issues, or they're just busy. They're afraid of commitment. Look, I've heard it all before. They've been hurt. Or here's my personal favorite. That's just the way they are. Listen, listen, y'all, this is Authentic Coach talking to you. Let me tell you something. This is just the way they are does not mean that you are required to accept it. Okay, I always remind you guys, make sure you got pad and pen because I'm always dropping some nuggets for you. But I want you to understand why someone behaves a certain way, and this may give you context, I guess. It doesn't automatically give them permission, right? There is a difference between extending grace and abandoning your standards. There's a difference between being patient and repeatedly participating in your own disappointment. And there is a difference between recognizing that someone is imperfect and accepting behavior that continually leaves you confused, disrespected, or emotionally depleted. There's a difference, y'all. You need to recognize, right? So today, um, I'm not going to get lost in, nor I'm going to ask you to get lost in the trendy terminology. But what I am going to do is to ask you to go with me so that we can look underneath it. Because the real question again is not what are people calling this particular behavior. The real question is, why are you accepting it? Why are you continuing to excuse it? And perhaps the most uncomfortable question is, why are you participating in it yourself, right? So let me just start with that. Because it's it is easy, I guess you could say. It is easy to listen to a conversation like this and you start immediately identifying everybody who has done something to you, right? You can name your ex, you can name the friend, you can name the family member, you can name the co-worker. But listen, self-awareness requires you to ask, have I ever disappeared instead of communicating, right? Have I ever emotionally checked out without being honest? Have I kept someone around because I was afraid to be alone? How about this one? Have I demanded commitment in one setting while behaving single in another? Y'all know what I'm talking about. I know you do. That is where the real unpacking begins. And so that's why I say, let's unpack this. So let's get into it, right? So let me start with ghost lighting, right? Let's begin with that. Most people are familiar with ghosting. Ghosting is basically is when someone disappears. They stop calling, they stop texting, responding, no conversation, no explanation, basically no clear ending. And then one day out of the blue, they're present. And the next day, they're gone. Ghostlighting adds another layer. The person disappears, but when they return or when they are confronted about this disappearance, they basically deny, minimize, or distort what happened. Now, get this. They may say some stuff like, I didn't disappear. You're exaggerating. It wasn't even that long. I told you I was busy. You just being too sensitive. We were never that serious in the first place. I don't even understand why you're making such a big deal. Now, hold on. Wait a minute. You stopped communicating. You ignored the messages. You disappeared for days, weeks, months, or even longer. And then you return as if nothing happened. But listen, the other person is being unreasonable because they notice. Y'all got that? So that is the part that creates confusion. And ghostlighting is not simply, I did not communicate well. What it is, it becomes, I did not communicate well, and now I'm going to make you question whether you have a right to be affected by it. Y'all, that's not communication. That is avoidance that's mixed with blame shifting, right? And this behavior is not limited to just dating. A friend can disappear when you need support and later act as though you expected too much. Been there, done that. A family member can stop speaking to you, refuse to explain why, and then accuse you of creating division. Been there too, okay? Listen, you can even have a coworker who can fail to provide information, deny that you requested it, and then suggest that you're just disorganized. So what am I saying? What am I saying is that the setting may change, but the pattern remains the same, right? They avoid responsibility, then challenge your perception of what happened. And when this happens repeatedly, what happens is you may even begin second guessing yourself. Here you are asking, am I asking too much? Was I too emotional? Did I misunderstand? Maybe they really were busy. Maybe I should not have even brought it up. And I just want to say this and be very crystal clear. Healthy relationships do not require you to constantly argue for the validity of your own experience. Y'all get that? That was a nugget. Healthy relationships do not require you to constantly argue for the validity of your own experience. Two people may remember a different situation differently. I know that this happens. Yeah, it does. But someone who really values the relationship with you will usually be willing to listen. Now, they may say, that was not my intention, but I understand how my absence affected you. Or they could even say, I should have communicated better. I can see why that felt dismissive. I was overwhelmed, but I shouldn't have left you wondering. So can you see the difference there? You see what's happening? See, they're being accountable. Accountability does not always mean agreeing with every detail of somebody else's interpretation, but accountability does mean caring about the impact of your behavior. See, people who refuse accountability, they what they end up doing is they focus entirely on their own intentions, right? I didn't mean to hurt you. Okay? But did you hurt me? I didn't intend to ignore you, okay? But did you leave me without communication? I was going through something. And whereas that may be true, but did you use what you were experiencing as permission to disregard what your behavior was doing to somebody else? Yeah, I'm just asking you to think about those things. Now, your struggle may explain your behavior, but it doesn't erase its effects. And let me offer another side of this conversation. Sometimes people disappear because they do not feel emotionally or physically safe having a direct conversation. And that's real, y'all. That's real. See, there are situations where ending contact without further engagement, it really may be necessary. And not every person, you hear me say this all the time, not every person is owed continued access to you. And someone is threatening or controlling, abusive, or repeatedly violates your boundaries, protecting yourself is not the same as casually discarding someone. But you must be honest about the difference between protecting yourself and avoiding discomfort. Because sometimes you may call it protecting your peace when you're really avoiding a conversation. And I think sometimes you may call, hey, I set a boundary, when what you're really doing is you're punishing someone by not talking to them. You just give them dead silence, right? So sometimes you may even say, I don't know anybody any explanation because you don't want to have to face the discomfort of telling the truth. Nope. Let me just be real clear. You do not owe everyone unlimited access. But when a relationship has been meaningful, safe, and established, basic honesty is a form of respect. And what you can do in those situations, you can say, I no longer want to continue this relationship. That's it. That's it. I don't have the capacity to maintain this connection. I need distance. My feelings have changed. This dynamic is no longer healthy for me. Now, I want to say this. I know that those conversations like that, they may be uncomfortable, right? But discomfort is not always danger. Sometimes discomfort is just simply the price of emotional maturity. Okay? So you got to ask yourself this. Do I communicate when my feelings change, or do I disappear and make the other person figure it out? And when someone tells me that my actions hurt them, do I listen, or do I immediately make them defend their feelings, right? That is the ghostlighting question. Okay? Now, Banksying, and that's Banksying. Banksying. Let me talk about Banksying for a moment, right? Banksying basically describes a person deciding that a relationship is over but they just not going to tell the other person. They're not going to tell that other party or that partner, right? Instead, what they do is begin to quietly prepare their own exit. They emotionally detach, they stop investing, they become distant, they definitely reduce affection, they may even stop making future plans, and they may begin building a new routine that doesn't include that partner, include you, right? So by the time they finally announce a breakup, they've already spent weeks or months processing the end. They have had time to grieve, they have talked to friends, they have imagined what their life was going to be after this relationship. And here's the thing, y'all. They may have even arranged housing, finances, or other support system. But to the other person that is hearing the truth for the first time, you can only imagine what that's like. So one person had a head start and the other person just simply got blindsided. Not every relationship has season. That's a nugget. Again, not every relationship has seasons. People get tired. People become distracted. Work becomes demanding. Families experience pressure. Health issues arise. Affections may fluctuate. A period of distance does not automatically mean that someone is secretly planning an exit, but I have to tell you, there is a difference between struggling within a relationship and deliberately withdrawing while pretending that everything is still intact, right? So is not merely losing interest. What it is privately acting on a decision that directly affects another person while withholding that decision from them. And I know some of you may know what I'm talking about, right? I've been in those relationships. That's why I wrote the book, When to Get Up from the Table When Love is Not Being Served. That love is a metaphor. But I want you to just think about that. You have no clue. Think about how disorienting that can be. One person notices the distance and asks, is something wrong? But the other person says, no, everything is fine. Stop overthinking. You imagine and think. I'm just tired. Meanwhile, everything is not fine. They have already decided to leave. And I have to say, that is not kindness. Sometimes people tell themselves they are delaying the conversation because they don't want to hurt their partner, but postponing the truth does not necessarily reduce the hurt. And sometimes it only ensures that the other person remains emotionally invested in something that has already ended privately. You're still accepting their love. You're still accepting their loyalty. You're still allowing them to plan a future with you. You are still benefiting from their presence while secretly preparing a life without them. That is not protecting them, y'all. That is protecting yourself from the immediate reaction from that fallout, right? And there is a difference. So, and for me, I guess I would say I understand that ending a relationship can be complicated, especially if they're if say like there's shared property, children may involve, finances intertwined. There could even be safety concerns or legal considerations. Sometimes a person must prepare carefully before leaving, especially when abuse is involved, control or financial dependency is involved. So let me be clear, that is not what I am criticizing, right? Safety planning is not emotional manipulation, but in an otherwise safe relationship, withholding your decision simply because you do not want to face the uncomfortable conversation, that's unfair. Bottom line, you cannot expect someone to repair what you have already decided to abandon, right? And you can't punish them for not addressing concerns you never honestly communicated, right? Come on, y'all. I know you hear what I'm saying. You don't know how to communicate, right? And you say, I don't want to hurt their feelings. Wow. Okay. And you cannot say I've been unhappy for a year. When the other person repeatedly has asked you what was wrong and you kept saying nothing. All right now. So see, people cannot respond to truths you refuse to speak. Now there is another side. Perhaps you are the person sensing that your partner has emotionally left. You feel the distance, you notice that the warmth has changed, that the other person does not initiate any kind of conversations, and you're the only person making plans. You're trying harder while they participate less. Do not, I guess I'm going to say, do not immediately accuse them of Banksying, but do not ignore a sustained pattern either, right? See, y'all got to be somewhat detectives too. Ask direct questions, not 20 indirect questions. No hints, no tests. Ask, are you still committed to building this relationship? Have your feelings changed? Are you willing to work on what is happening between us? And then pay attention to more than the answer. Pay attention to what their actions supports it, right? Someone can say, I love you, while continually behaving as though your relationship is an obligation. Someone can say, I want this to work, while refusing every opportunity to work on it, right? We don't need counseling. You go out and find somebody, and when you do, or you go to counseling, no. Words matter, y'all. Patterns clarify. You hear that? Words matter, patterns clarify. And here is the self-awareness question for you. Have you ever stayed physically present in a relationship after you had emotionally decided to leave? Were you afraid to be honest? Were you waiting for the right time, or waiting until you had enough money, or waiting for another person, right? Um, were you hoping that the other person would end it so you wouldn't have to? Did you intentionally behave badly so they would finally walk away? All of this happens too. See, some people don't end relationships. They create such an unpleasant environment that the other person is forced to end it for them. And then they say, you left me, or they tell friends, she left me or he left me. No, you may not have officially ended it, but you withdrew, what do I want to say? You withdrew the ingredients required to sustain it, right? And honesty is not always about what we say. It is also about what you strategically refuse to say. So moving on to monkey barring, right? Let's unpack monkey barring, sometimes called monkey branching. I just want you to picture a monkey moving through the trees, right? It does not release one branch until it has secured the next one. So therefore, in relationships, monkey bearing basically describes holding on to a current relationship while quietly developing or securing another connection, right? The person may not physically cheat, but they begin emotionally investing somewhere else. They begin sharing personal information with someone new. They start comparing their partner with the new person. And look, let's not forget, you know, when they're on these websites, right? Uh, as single, they look, they're already moving forward. They direct their excitement, attention, and curiosity towards the potential replacement, right? Um, I recently just watched a show and they were talking about a guy who was married on Tinder, but his profile said that he was single. And that his wife had left him, all these things. None of them was the truth. But a friend happened to see his profile on Tinder and recognized who it was. So, sometimes with monkey barring, they keep the current relationship intact until they have secured a new opportunity, right? And then they just let go. And often the person who was left is shocked by how quickly the new relationship began. You find out they just left on Wednesday and they out partying with this person on Saturday. But many times what you need to understand, it did not begin after the breakup. So be real with yourself. The emotional foundation was not being constructed before I'm sorry, it was being constructed before the previous relationship officially ended. So let's tell the truth. Some people are not staying because they still want the relationship. They're staying because they don't want to be alone. The current person becomes emotional insurance, y'all. That's a new nugget. Emotional insurance. A placeholder, a safety net. Somebody that's going to fill that space until the next opportunity feels stable. That's not love. That is using one person to protect yourself from the uncertainty of transition. And let me make one important distinction. It is possible to meet someone, realize that your current relationship is unhealthy, and decide to leave. Whew, I'll be the first to tell you, emotions can be complicated. Attraction can happen. Connections can develop unexpectedly. But emotional integrity requires you to handle your current relationship honestly before fully entering into another one, right? And the problem is not merely noticing another person. The problem is secretly cultivating that relationship while your current partner believes that you're still fully committed. Why do people monkey bar? Fear of loneliness, fear of regret, losing emotional support, even fear just starting over, fear that the new person may not work out. So they keep trying to keep both doors open, right? They got one foot in the relationship, one foot out. Right? They got one hand on the old branch and they're still reaching for the new one. But the bottom line, somebody becomes collateral damage in that indecision. And sometimes the new person believes that they have won, right? They think, oh, they chose me or he or she chose me. But you need to pay attention to how someone transitions from one relationship into another. Where was the healing at? You got to ask yourself, how long were you in this relationship? Listen to your spidey senses, pay attention, because here's what you need to understand. The method that this person or used to choose you may eventually become the same method that they use to replace you. Now, that does not mean people can never grow, but it does mean you should not romanticize dishonestly simply because you benefited from it. They said the relationship was already over. Was it? Was it over? Or were they still living together, sharing a bed, making plans, and allowing the other person to believe they were committed? They said their partner didn't understand. Perhaps that was true, but why were they building intimacy with you instead of addressing or ending that relationship? These are questions that we have to ask ourselves, you guys, right? They said they were only staying for the children. Then why did they need you to wait secretly? I'm not saying this to condemn anybody. I am not. I'm saying it because we have normalized beginning relationships in the shadows and expecting them to thrive in the light, right? A relationship born through secrecy will eventually require serious conversation about trust. And let's bring this closer to home. Monkey barring does not only happen in romantic relationship. Some people do it in friendships. They keep one friend close until they're accepted by another social group. Then the old friend becomes inconvenient. Been there. Some people do it professionally. Been there. They maintain loyalty to a team or only until the next opportunity is guaranteed. Again, leaving is not the problem, right? Growth is not betrayal. Changing relationship is not automatically wrong. That's not what I'm saying. But using people until their replacement arrives, that's a character issue. People are not waiting rooms. They're not emotional layovers. They're not temporary bridges that you get to walk across on the way to somebody else that you consider better. If you're finished, be finished. Be honest. If you are uncertain, communicate. If you need time alone, take it. That space between relationships may be uncomfortable, but it can also be where healing begins, right? It has to happen. So when you refuse to experience that gap, what happens is you carry the unprocessed emotions directly into the next relationships. And you don't even give yourself time to ask, what happened? What did I learn? What did I tolerate? What did I contribute to this? What do I need to change? What am I actually looking for now? But instead, what happens is you use the excitement of someone new to silence the grief of what ended. But feelings postponed, another nugget, y'all. Feelings postponed are not feelings resolved. They are simply waiting for another opportunity to surface, right? So you got to ask yourself, am I choosing this new person, or am I using them to avoid being alone with myself? How about and if you're holding on to someone you no longer want because you're afraid of the next opportunity may not work out, that is the monkey bar in question, y'all. Let me talk to you about zip code commitment. The term zip coding has always been used in a couple of different ways. One meaning, or it involves limiting dating choices to people who live within a small geographical area. That can simply be practical. Distance matters, schedule and transportation matters. Nobody wants to spend half of every date sitting in traffic. So choosing to date locally is not automatically unhealthy, but the second meaning is what I want to focus on today. A relationship that exists only when two people are in the same location. When they are together, they behave like a committed couple. But when they are apart, one or both people consider themselves single. Now, here's a question. Can two consenting adults agree to that arrangement? Of course they can. Adults can define their relationships for themselves, but the essential word here is agree. The problem begins when one person believes the relationship is committed everywhere, while the other person believes commitment expires at the county line. That is not an arrangement. That is simply a lack of disclosure, y'all. You can't quietly create exceptions to a commitment that another person believes is mutual. You can't say, we're together when I'm in town, but what happens when I travel don't count. Unless the other person has knowingly and freely agreed to that. Commitment cannot depend on who is watching. You get that? Commitment cannot depend on who is watching. Integrity is what you do when the person you made the promise to is not standing in front of you. And zip coded commitment goes beyond geography. Some people are committed in private but single in public. At home, you are their partner. Around certain friends, they act unattached. At family gatherings, they introduce you vaguely. Online, they carefully hide any existence that you exist. At work, perhaps discretion is appropriate, but in every other area of your life, you're treated like confidential information. Some people are committed when they need comfort but unavailable when you need consistency. They want access to you late at night, but not accountability in the day. They want the benefits of emotional intimacy, but resist the language of commitment. They want exclusivity from you while preserving, another nugget, flexibility for themselves. That's not commitment, y'all. That's convenience with expectations attached, right? Let me say that again. That is convenience with expectations attached. Some people do not want a relationship. They just want convenient access to relationship benefits, right? I tell y'all in my book, I talk about, relationships are a booty call, right? These people want companionship without responsibility, affection without accountability, loyalty without transparency, and support without reciprocity. And because there are occasional moments of closeness, what happens? Many of you convince yourselves that the relationship is deeper than the pattern demonstrate. And here's what you say: when we are together, everything is wonderful. Okay. But what happens when you're apart? How do they communicate? How do they handle temptation? Do they acknowledge the relationship? Do they keep the promises they made when you were in the same room? See, a healthy relationship should not require constant physical supervision to remain intact. Now, long distance relationships require clearly defined expectation. What does commitment mean? How often will we communicate? Are we exclusive? How will you handle social situations? What are the boundaries around dating, flirting, and intimacy? When will you see each other? Is there a realistic plan for eventually living in the same place? These conversations may not feel romantic, right? But ambiguity becomes far less romantic when two people discover they were participating in two different relationships, because one person thought that we're building a future and the other person said we're enjoying the present. Another person thought we were exclusive, whereas the other thought we never officially said that. Somebody could be saying we're taking our time, and the other person thought I'm keeping my options open. Don't assume, ask. And do not be afraid that asking for clarity will scare someone away. Clarity does not destroy healthy potential. Clarity exposes incompatible intentions, y'all. That may be disappointing, but it is useful. Sometimes we actually avoid defining a relationship because, you're afraid of the answer. Would you rather live your life with hopeful ambiguity than hear a clear no? But I want to tell you, ambiguity can keep you sitting at a table where commitment is never going to be served, right? You're waiting for the relationship to become what you imagine. You're interpreting occasional attention as progress. You're accepting partial access and calling it patience. Oh, come on, y'all. You're waiting for someone to choose you while they're enjoying all the benefits and not having to choose. At some point, hear me when I say this, you must ask, what relationship am I actually in? Not the one I hope this will become, but the one that the current behavior demonstrates? That is the zip-coded commitment question. And what do all of these behaviors have in common, y'all? Ghostlighting, Banksying, monkey barring, zip code commitment. Different labels, different circumstances, but they share a common theme: avoidance, ambiguity, fear, convenience, and a lack of accountability. Ghostlighting avoids responsibility for disappearing. Banksying avoids the discomfort of an honest ending. Monkey barring avoids the vulnerability of being alone. Zip-coded commitment avoids the responsibility of being consistent. Every behavior offers the person doing it some form of protection or convenience. But that protection usually comes at someone else's emotional expense. And that is how unhealthy behavior becomes normalized. One person says that is just how dating works, and another says everybody keeps their options open. Somebody else may say you cannot expect people to communicate all the time, and somebody else says you should have known we weren't serious. And eventually, basic respect begins to sound like an unreasonable demand. Expecting communication is called clingy. Expecting honesty is called pressure. Expecting consistency is called controlling. And expecting clarity is called rushing. No, absolutely not. No. There is a difference between demanding constant access to someone and expecting basic communication. There is a difference between controlling someone and asking them to honor the commitment they made freely. There's a difference between rushing a relationship and requesting clarity about what you are participating in. And some of y'all know, I know you know, some of you been in relationship for 2, 3, 4, 5 years. You didn't set the boundary. You started out one way. Hey, here are my goals. This is what I want. I want to be married and blah, blah, blah. If that's not where you are, you're not working towards that. You're not rushing, you know, into a relationship. And I want to tell you, you're allowed to ask questions. You're allowed to require honesty. You are allowed to decide that ambiguity does not work for you. You are allowed, nugget, to walk away from a relationship that repeatedly makes you question your place in it. And you do not need to turn the other person into a villain before deciding that the relationship is not healthy for you. Sometimes people are not malicious. They're just emotionally immature. They avoid conflict. They are afraid. They're confused. They may genuinely care about you. I want to tell you, but caring about you does not automatically mean they have the capacity to build a healthy relationship with you. Intentions matter. Capacity matters too. You can love someone who is not ready, and you can understand someone who is still unhealthy. You can have compassion for somebody who still refuses to participate in their pattern. And that is where boundaries enter. And again, you've heard me, if you've been with me all this time, I talk a lot about boundaries. A boundary is not, you must change so that I can be comfortable. A boundary is simply, if this pattern continues, I will decide what I need to do to protect my well-being. A boundary does not require the other person's agreement. It requires you or your follow-through, right? So the personal accountability check, before I close, I want you to do a personal accountability check. Not a let me diagnose my X check, not a this reminds me of my friend check, not a personal check. Ask yourself, have I ever gone silent because I wanted someone to chase me? Have I denied withdrawing when I knew I was creating distance? Have I told someone they were imagining things when they accurately noticed that my behavior had changed? Have I remained in a relationship while privately planning my departure? Even ask yourself, have you accepted someone's loyalty after you had stopped offering yours? Have you started building an emotional connection with someone new before honestly ending your current relationship? Have you kept somebody around because you feared loneliness? Right? Listen, those questions are not meant to shame you. They are meant to awaken you, because you cannot change behavior that you refuse to acknowledge. And saying everybody does it does not make it healthy. I don't care if it's the coolest thing to do nowadays. Common does not mean acceptable. Familiar does not mean functional. Normalized does not mean necessary. Now, perhaps you yourself recognize you in one of these patterns. That does not mean you are irredeemable. It means you have an opportunity to make a different choice. You can have the conversation, you can apologize, you can stop keeping people on standby. Look, tell the truth about your intentions. You can end one relationship before entering another. You can stop using confusion as a substitute for commitment. And you can decide that your relationships will be built on something stronger than convenience and fear. And perhaps, just perhaps, you recognize that someone has been doing these things to you. Your responsibility is not to force them to become accountable, but your responsibility is to pay attention to the pattern and decide what access you will continue to provide. Stop arguing with evidence. Stop trying to convince someone to value the relationship they continually mishandle. Stop reducing your standards because inconsistency has become common. You don't need a trendy label to know when something is hurting you. And you certainly do not need social media to validate what repeated behavior. has already revealed. Trust what the pattern is teaching you, right? So as I close this particular episode, I want you to remember this. Every generation creates new language for relationships, but healthy relationships still require many of the same things they have always required: honesty, communication, respect, consistency, courage, accountability, and emotional maturity. No catchy dating terms changes that. So whether you want to call it ghostlighting, Banksying, monkey barring, or zip code commitment, the deeper issue is how you treat people when honesty becomes uncomfortable. Do you disappear, deny, manipulate? Do you keep people around until something better arrives? Do you create private exceptions to public promises? Or do you just tell the truth? Communicate, take responsibility in relationship with as much integrity as you entered into them. Because how you leave a relationship says something about you. How you behave when nobody is watching says something about you. And how you handle another person's heart, even when you no longer want the relationship, it says something about you, right? So you can't keep demanding healthy love while normalizing unhealthy behavior, or ask for transparency while holding or hiding your intentions. You can't ask for loyalty while keeping backup options, and you cannot ask for commitment um, in communication while you use silence as a punishment, right? So this week, I'm just going to ask you to unpack this question. What relationship have I normalized simply because I have experienced it repeatedly? And then ask, what would it look like to stop accepting it and to stop participating in it? Because after all, that is where change begins. Not with the terminology, not with the other person, but with your decision to become more honest, more aware, and more intentional about the relationships you choose. As always, I want to thank you so much for joining me for another episode of Unpack This with me, Gloria Bailey-Ray, the authentic host, right? I'm going to ask that you share this episode with someone who may need this conversation. Follow the show, y'all. Follow the show. Leave me comments. I so appreciate seeing all of your comments. And let me know, which of these behaviors have you seen normalized in relationships? So until next time, keep unpacking the beliefs, behaviors, and patterns that prevent you from living and loving authentically. Hey, I'm Gloria Bailey-Ray, the authentic coach. And remember this, a behavior does not become healthy simply because everybody has learned how to tolerate it. Peace and blessing, y'all. I'm out.